The sound of a shovel hitting frozen earth is a rhythm the neighbors have come to loathe. At the edge of a quiet, judgmental suburb, William Wynne is digging. He doesn't look like a gardener. At 50, his frame is a fortress of muscle and scars, a relic of a dozen wars the public was never told about. Beside him, Smokey, a German shepherd with eyes like amber fire, watches a perimeter with the intensity of a predator. Every shovelful of dirt is met with a snicker from the driveway next door. "Building a grave for your sanity, Wynne," they shout. They see a broken veteran obsessed with a hole in the ground. They see a greenhouse buried beneath the frost. But William doesn't hear them. He hears the shifting of the jet stream. He feels the unnatural stillness in the air that precedes a cataclysm. In his mind, he isn't digging a garden. He is reinforcing a bunker. The steel plates are being welded. The hydroponic lights are being calibrated. The world is comfortable, warm, and blissfully ignorant. They think February will bring just another dusting of snow. William knows better. He has seen civilizations fall for less than a 10-degree shift. This isn't madness. It's a countdown. The neighbors record him on their phones, laughing at the man who treats a backyard project like a Black Ops mission. But as the sun dips below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the trenches, the air temperature drops 10 degrees in a single hour. The mockery is about to freeze in their throats. The storm didn't arrive with a roar. It arrived with a silence so absolute it felt like the world had stopped breathing. By midnight on February 3rd, the temperature plummeted to 40 below. The power grid, aged and brittle, surrendered within minutes. Transformers across the county exploded like silent blue fireworks, leaving tens of thousands in a tomb of darkness. Inside his underground sanctuary, William Wynne watches the monitors. The greenhouse is a marvel of improvised engineering. 6 feet of earth and concrete insulation keep the internal temperature at a steady 70 degrees. Rows of kale, spinach, and high-calorie root vegetables bask in the warm. Artificial glow of LED arrays powered by a silent, vibration-dampened diesel generator. Smokey lies on a recycled wool blanket, his ears twitching at the sound of the wind howling against the hatch above. Outside, the world is dying. The neighbors who laughed are now huddling under thin polyester blankets, their breath visible in their living rooms. They try to turn on their stoves, but the gas lines are freezing. They try to call for help, but the cell towers have collapsed under the weight of the ice. William sips a cup of hot coffee, his moss-green eyes reflecting the green of the plants. He isn't gloating. He is preparing his kit. He knows that soon the knocking will begin. Not a neighborly knock, but the desperate, rhythmic pounding of people who have realized their arrogance was a death sentence. He checks his tactical vest. He checks Smokey's harness. The madman is the only one with a key to survival. The first knock isn't a knock at all. It's a sound of a heavy body collapsing against a steel hatch. Above ground, the blizzard has reached a fever pitch. Visibility is zero. The neighborhood has become an alien landscape of white dunes and lethal wind. William Wynne reaches for his thermal goggles. He knows that sound. It's the sound of surrender. He climbs the ladder, his boots clanging on the rungs. When he cracks the hatch, the fury of the storm tries to rip it from his hands. A wall of white death pours in. There, huddled in the snow, is the man from across the street, the one who had laughed loudest, the one who called the police when William started the illegal excavation. The neighbor is blue, his eyelashes heavy with ice, his hands clawing at the cold steel. He isn't laughing now. He can't even speak. William grabs a man by his collar with a strength that defies his age and drags him into the warmth. Smokey stands at the top of the stairs, a silent sentinel, his eyes judging the newcomer. As the neighbor hits the warm floor of the greenhouse, the smell of damp earth and growing life hits him. He looks around at the rows of green plants and the glowing lights in disbelief. He thought he was coming to a tomb. He found a cathedral of life. But William doesn't stop to explain. He looks at the monitors again. There are more heat signatures out there, fading, flickering like dying candles in the wind. The mission has changed. It's no longer about survival. It's about a combat search and rescue in a suburban hellscape. The suburb is transformed into a lunar landscape of ice and jagged shadows. Every house is a frozen tomb, the silence broken only by the screaming wind that carries a deadly chill of -50 degrees. William Wynne moves with the calculated precision of a ghost. He isn't just walking. He is navigating a battlefield where the enemy is the air itself. Smoky is a blur of black and tan, his powerful legs driving through the deep drifts, his nose catching the faint scent of human life trapped beneath the snow. They reach the Miller house, the site of the most frequent complaints against William's eyesore. The front door is buried. William doesn't knock. He uses a tactical breaching tool to shatter the ice lock frame. Inside, the family is huddled in the basement, their lips blue, their eyes glazing over in the final stages of hypothermia. The father looks up, seeing a terrifying figure in a respirator and goggles, a wolf-like dog at his side. He thinks death has finally come for them. But death doesn't carry a thermos of high-calorie broth. Death doesn't wrap you in a self-heating military shroud. William speaks no word of comfort. He only gives orders. One by one, he tethers them to his primary line. The journey back to the greenhouse is a brutal crawl against a wind that feels like broken glass. Every step is a gamble with the abyss. Smoky stays at the rear, nipping at the heels of those who stumble, forcing them to keep moving, forcing them to live. The man who once called William a threat to the community is now clinging to William's tactical vest as if it's the only solid thing left in the universe. The bunker is no longer a solitary retreat. It is a crowded ark. 12 people, once strangers or enemies, are now crammed between rows of thriving tomatoes and Swiss chard. The air is thick with the smell of wet wool, oxygen-rich soil, and the metallic tang of the diesel heater. William Wynne moves among them with the efficiency of a field medic. He distributes bowls of hot, nutrient-dense soup made from the very plants they once mocked. The contrast is jarring. Outside, the world is a frozen wasteland of -60 degrees. Inside, the LED suns provide a surreal, purple-hued summer. Smoky weaves to the legs of the seated neighbors, his aggressive demeanor replaced by a calm, watchful presence that seems to soothe the traumatized children. The neighbor who led the harassment campaign sits in a corner, staring at a cluster of ripening cherry tomatoes. He realizes that the illegal excavation wasn't a veteran's delusion. It was an act of profound foresight. William doesn't offer a "told you so." He is too busy monitoring the carbon dioxide scrubbers and calculating the fuel burn rate. He knows the storm isn't over. The pressure is still dropping. He looks at his maps, plotting the locations of the remaining houses. There are more people out there. He checks his oxygen tanks. He is going back out. The madman still has work to do. For days. That's how long the great whiteout held the state in its icy fist. For 4 days. William Wynne and Smoky became the only bridge between life and death for the 3-block radius around his home. They made 6 more trips into the abyss, bringing the total number of refugees in the greenhouse to 24. Food was rationed, but no one went hungry. The water was recycled, but no one went thirsty. In the cramped, humid warmth of the underground garden, a strange transformation occurred. The social barriers of the suburb, the petty jealousies, the property value disputes, the judgment melted away. In the face of extinction, they were just humans huddled in the dirt. On the fifth morning, the wind finally died. The sun rose over a world that looked like it had been carved from marble. William climbed the ladder and pushed against the hatch. It took 3 men to help him break through the 8 feet of snow that had piled on top of them. As he emerged into the blinding white light, William didn't look for praise. He looked for the horizon. He saw the black smoke of distant rescue convoys finally breaking through the main roads. He turned back to the hatch and signaled his guests that it was safe. He had done his duty. But as the neighbors climbed out, blinking at the sun, they realized they weren't just leaving a bunker. They were leaving a man who had saved their lives while they were busy trying to ruin his. The thaw began slowly, but the social landscape of the suburb had changed forever. As the National Guard trucks rolled through the slushy streets, the story of the madman's greenhouse spread like wildfire. Major news outlets arrived. Their cameras pointed at the unassuming hatch in William Wynne's backyard. But William didn't want the spotlight. He had retreated back into the earth, back to the quiet hum of his hydroponic pumps and the steady breathing of Smokey. The neighbors, however, couldn't stop talking. They stood on their porches, looking at their own homes, now scarred by burst pipes and ruined interiors, and then at William's yard. They realized that their mockery had been a defense mechanism against a truth they weren't prepared to face, that the world is fragile, and they were unprotected. The local council, which had once issued fines against William for unauthorized structures, now sheepishly sent a delegation to drop the charges. They found him in his garden, pruning a new batch of tomatoes. He didn't look up when they spoke. He didn't need their validation then, and he certainly didn't need it now. For William, the greenhouse wasn't a point to be proven. It was a silent promise kept to himself, a soldier's vow that as long as he breathed, no one under his watch would succumb to the cold. Smokey sat at the entrance, his amber eyes tracking every movement of the officials with a low, vibrating growl. The message was clear. The war against the storm was won, but the perimeter remained locked. Spring brought more than just melting snow. It brought a new kind of attention. Government agencies, curious about civilian structure that outperformed million-dollar shelters, began knocking on William's door. They wanted the blueprints. They wanted to know the secret to his soil and his silent power grid. William Wynne gave them nothing but a cold stare. To him, survival wasn't a product to be sold or a patent to be filed. It was a mindset. He watched from his porch as the neighbors began prepping their own homes, buying generators and hoarding canned goods in a panic frenzy. They were missing the point. It wasn't about the gear. It was about the discipline. Smokey sensed a shift in the air before William did. A low, guttural vibration in the dog's chest alerted the veteran to a new sound, the heavy thrum of black helicopters circling the outskirts of the town. This wasn't a rescue mission. The underground greenhouse had become a point of interest for the very military machine William had tried to leave behind. He realized then that the peace he had built was a fragile thing. His moss-green eyes hardened. He began checking his old footlocker, the one hidden beneath the floorboards of the greenhouse. February was over, but a different kind of winter was approaching, one that would be solved with soup and blankets. They came at 3 o'clock, the tactical witching hour. No sirens, no shouting, just the crunch of boots on gravel and the hiss of suppressed rifles. A search and seize order for perceived national security threat. The government wanted the technology William Wynne had built in his backyard, but they made one fatal mistake. They treated a retired Tier 1 operator like a common prepper. As the first team breached the fence, the garden lights didn't turn on. Instead, a high-frequency acoustic pulse, hidden within the ventilation system, staggered the intruders. Smokey was out of the shadows before they could regain their balance. He didn't bark. He was a silent missile of muscle and teeth, neutralizing the lead scout with surgical precision. William Wynne didn't use a gun. He used the environment he had spent months sculpting. The greenhouse transformed. Hidden shutters locked down the glass. The air in the trench turned into a thick, non-lethal obscurant gas. From his monitors below, William watched the elite team stumble through his garden. He wasn't trying to kill them. He was showing them the difference between a soldier who follows orders and a man who defends his home. Through the fog, William emerged, wearing a night vision array, looking less like a veteran and more like a myth. "You're trespassing," he whispered into the comms channel he had intercepted. The hunt had officially begun. The failure of the first breach only escalated the stakes. By 5 o'clock, the suburb had been transformed into a restricted zone. The government hadn't just sent a team. They had deployed a small army, justifying it under Internal Security Protocol 9. To the neighbors watching from behind their curtains, it looked like a military coup in their own backyards. But to William Wynne, this was simply a shift in theater. He moved through the underground tunnels he'd quietly excavated months prior, tunnels the neighbors thought were just deep irrigation pipes. Smokey moved with him, a ghost in the dark, his K-9 senses detecting the vibration of heavy armored vehicles approaching the perimeter. William wasn't panicked. He was a master of asymmetrical warfare. He began activating his passive defense layer. Large industrial fans, originally meant for greenhouse circulation, were reversed, drawing the freezing morning air into the breach points at hurricane speeds. Hidden high-voltage coils hummed beneath the wet mud of the garden, turning the soil into a deterrent that no boot could cross. Inside the greenhouse, the lush tomatoes and kale remained untouched, protected by layers of ballistic glass and reinforced steel. As a thermal imaging drone hovered overhead, William looked up and smiled, a grim, square-jawed expression of a man who had already won the psychological war. He knew their Achilles heel. They were fighting for a paycheck, while he was fighting for the only home he had left after 30 years of service. He reached for a heavy lever. It was time to show them that the madman had teeth they hadn't even seen yet. The failure of the first breach only escalated the stakes. By 5 o'clock, the suburb had been transformed into a restricted zone. The government hadn't just sent a team. They had deployed a small army, justifying it under Internal Security Protocol 9. To the neighbors watching from behind their curtains, it looked like a military coup in their own backyards. But to William Wynne, this was simply a shift in theater. He moved through the underground tunnels he'd quietly excavated months prior, tunnels the neighbors thought were just deep irrigation pipes. Smokey moved with him, a ghost in the dark, his K-9 senses detecting the vibration of heavy armored vehicles approaching perimeter. William wasn't panicked. He was a master of asymmetrical warfare. He began activating his passive defense layer. Large industrial fans, originally meant for greenhouse circulation, were reversed, drawing the freezing morning air into the breach points at hurricane speeds. Hidden high-voltage coils hummed beneath the wet mud of the garden, turning the soil into a deterrent that no boot could cross. Inside the greenhouse, the lush tomatoes and kale remained untouched, protected by layers of ballistic glass and reinforced steel. As a thermal imaging drone hovered overhead, William looked up and smiled, a grim, square-jawed expression of a man who had already won the psychological war. He knew their Achilles heel. They were fighting for a paycheck, while he was fighting for the only home he had left after 30 years of service. He reached for a heavy lever. It was time to show them that the madman had teeth they hadn't even seen yet. The smoke cleared as quickly as it had arrived. The mercenary team was neutralized, scattered by the combined fury of a veteran, his K-9, and a government unit that had chosen honor over orders. The backyard was a ruin, a landscape of craters, spent brass, and frozen mud. But the hatch to the underground greenhouse remained intact. William Wynne stood in the center of the devastation, his moss-green eyes scanning the horizon for any further threats. The government officer approached him, wiping soot from his forehead. "You can't stay here, Wynne. Not after this. They'll keep coming, not just for the tech, but for the man who proved it works." William looked down at Smokey, who was licking a small graze on his leg. He knew the officer was right. The secret was out. The sanctuary he had built to protect his neighbors had become a target that endangered them. As the sun began to set, casting a long, golden light over the broken garden, the neighbors he had saved began to emerge from their homes. They didn't come with cameras or phones. They came with shovels, blankets, and a silent, collective resolve. They began to fill in the craters. They began to clear the debris. They were no longer the people who mocked him. They were his perimeter. But William knew his watch in this suburb had ended. He looked at the greenhouse one last time, the vibrant green life thriving beneath the scarred earth, and realized that his mission wasn't to stay, but to teach. The suburb was a memory in the rearview mirror, but the lesson stayed behind. William Wynne and Smokey didn't just disappear. They ascended 200 miles north, where the tree-line thins and the air carries the scent of ancient pine and granite. William had a secondary site, a jagged piece of land he bought under a shell company years ago. This wasn't a garden for neighbors. This was a fortress for the future. As the truck climbed the steep, winding logging roads, Smokey sat with his head out the window, his ears catching the change in atmospheric pressure. Here, there were no judgmental fences or prying eyes. There was only the raw, unforgiving beauty of the wilderness. William pulled the truck into a natural cave opening, reinforced with heavy timber and steel. He wasn't starting from scratch. He had been preparing this site for a decade. A deep rock bunker powered by geothermal vents and hidden from satellite thermal imaging by the thick mountain crust. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on virgin snow. His moss-green eyes scanned the peaks. The world below was still reeling from the February freeze and the political fallout of the greenhouse siege. But up here, the only law was survival. William opened the heavy blast doors, the hydraulic hiss echoing through the canyon. "Home, Smokey," he muttered. The dog didn't hesitate, bolting into the dark, ready to claim their new territory. The veteran followed, the weight of the suburb finally lifting, replaced by the familiar, heavy mantle of a soldier at his post. In the belly of the mountain, nature provided what the suburb couldn't: infinite, silent energy. William Wynne harnessed the earth's own heartbeat. The new greenhouse wasn't just a pit in the dirt. It was a cathedral of glass and stone, built into a natural sun-facing cleft in the cliffside. The geothermal pipes ran beneath the soil, keeping the roots at a constant, perfect temperature even as a blizzard raged outside the rocks. Here, William began his most ambitious project, the legacy seeds. These were ancient, resilient varieties he collected during his tours in the Middle East and Central Asia, plants that could survive a drought or freeze with equal defiance. As he worked the soil, his muscular frame silhouetted against the bright alpine sun, William realized he was no longer preparing for a disaster. He was building a library of life. Smokey acted as his foreman, patrolling the tiers of the vertical garden, his paws silent on the stone walkways. But the peace was a thin veil. William's encrypted satellite link began to chime, a sequence he hadn't heard in years. It was a distress signal from the government officer he'd fought alongside in the suburb. The agency hadn't forgotten him. They had been infiltrated. The corporate entities that attacked his greenhouse were now moving on the capital. The veteran looked at his thriving plants, then at his rifle. The world was calling the madman back to the front. The descent was faster than the climb. William Wynne didn't drive the truck back. He used a modified, all-terrain tactical motorcycle with Smokey secured in a specialized side pod. They were a streak of iron and for cutting through the mountain passes. The news on the radio was dire. The Great Whiteout was being weaponized. Corporate-backed militias were using the chaos of the climate collapse to seize control of food, distribution hubs under the guise of emergency management. The suburb William had saved was now a fortified camp, the greenhouse he built being used as a research lab for the very people who had tried to kill him. William didn't go to the capital. He went back to the neighborhood. He wasn't there to save him again. He was there to take back what was his. As he approached the perimeter of his old home, he saw the fences were higher. The guards were armed with high-end tech, and the neighbors were being treated like laborers. His moss-green eyes burned with a cold, righteous fury. He didn't need an army. He had Smokey, his knowledge of every inch of that soil, and the element of surprise that only a ghost can provide. The madman had returned, and this time he wasn't bringing soup. The infiltration was silent, a masterclass in tactical infiltration. William Wynne knew the geometry of this land better than any surveyor or soldier. He knew where the soil was softest, where the shadows pooled deepest, and exactly where he had buried the backup manual override for the greenhouse's security. 2 guards stood at the hatch, their rifles slung casually, a fatal mistake of overconfidence. Smokey moved first, a low-slung shadow that didn't even disturb the frost. In one fluid motion, the K-9 neutralized the guard on the left, his jaws locking onto the pressure point with disciplined restraint. Before the second guard could shout, William emerged from the dark like a vengeful spirit. A single, precise strike to the carotid sinus, and the man was down. William didn't linger. He swiped the key card and descended into the familiar warmth of his creation. But it was no longer a garden of life. The corporate scientists had replaced his heirloom vegetables with experimental, fast-growth synthetic strains, pumping the air with chemicals that smelled of ozone and bleach. His moss-green eyes narrowed. This wasn't farming. It was a factory of greed. He reached the main terminal. His fingers danced over the keys as he initiated a data purge and redirected the geothermal flow. Above ground, the sirens began to wail. The ghost had been detected, but the reclamation had already begun. William looked at Smokey, the dog's hackles raised, and felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. They weren't just protecting a garden anymore. They were burning down a lie. The neighbors weren't the same people William had left behind. In the weeks of corporate occupation, they had learned the true cost of their safety. When William emerged from the hidden exit into the basement of his former antagonist, he didn't find a man ready to call the police. He found a man holding a makeshift crowbar, eyes burning with a mix of shame and desperation. When, the neighbor whispered, "We were wrong. They're taking everything, not just the garden, but our dignity." William didn't waste time on apologies. He handed the man a tactical radio and a map. "Then help me take it back," William said, his voice a low gravel. The word spread through the dark suburb like a silent pulse. One by one, the people William had saved in February began to rise. They weren't soldiers, but they were a community led by a ghost. As the corporate mercenaries scrambled to the greenhouse to save their data, They found themselves trapped in a suburban maze. Gates were locked, tires were slashed, and the very people they had oppressed were now acting as a civilian shield for William's exit. William and Smokey moved through the chaos, not as targets, but as the spark. The suburb was no longer a collection of houses. It was a resistance. And in the center of it all, the veteran and his dog were the tactical spine, turning a neighborhood of victims into a force of defiance. The diversion held, but the corporate machine was far from defeated. As the suburb glowed with the fires of a local uprising, William Wynne and Smokey retreated into the only place the mercenaries feared, the dead zone. This was a 5-mile stretch of forest and swamp that had been declared impassable after the February storm, a graveyard of frozen trees and unstable ice. William didn't have a motorcycle anymore. He was on foot, carrying a heavy rucksack and the data that could dismantle the corporate energy monopoly. The temperature was dropping again, a secondary frost hitting the region. Smokey led the way, his K9 intuition finding the solid ground hidden beneath the treacherous snow. They weren't just running. They were being hunted by thermal imaging helicopters and high-altitude drones. William moved with the rhythm of a man who had survived a dozen winter campaigns. He used thermal blankets to mask their heat signatures, hiding under the roots of fallen giants while the searchlights swept the forest floor like the eyes of God. Every breath was a plume of white steam, every step a gamble against the cracking ice of the swamp. He looked at Smokey. The dogs were covered in a fine layer of rime, and felt a pang of guilt. But Smokey didn't complain. He just looked back with those amber eyes. A silent promise that they would make it to the mountains or die together in the ice. The madman and his dog were no longer just survivors. They were the most dangerous fugitives on the continent. The border between the lowlands and the mountain range was marked by the Black Gorge, a vertical wound in the earth bridged only by a rusting pre-war railway trestle. In the teeth of a blizzard, the metal groaned like a dying beast. William Wynne knew the mercenary pursuit teams were closing in. Their snowmobiles hummed in the distance, a mechanical swarm hunting blood. He had no choice but to cross. The wind on the trestle was a physical force, trying to hurl them into the 300-foot abyss below. Smokey, for the first time in his life, hesitated. The gaps between the ties were slick with black ice, and the void beneath was a hungry shadow. William knelt in the howling wind, his hand gripping Smokey's tactical harness. "Eyes on me, partner," he shouted over the gale. They move as one, a man of iron and a hound of fire. Halfway across, the lead mercenary snowmobile reached the gorge. A spotlight cut through the whiteout, pinning them to the narrow tracks. Bullets began to spark off the iron girders. William didn't fire back. He reached for a remote detonator he'd set at the start of the bridge. He wasn't just crossing, he was closing the door. As the final span of the bridge groaned, William and Smokey made a desperate leap for the far ledge just as the charges blew. The explosion was a secondary sun in the white hell, a wall of fire that severed the hunters from their prey. The explosion bought them time, but the mountain was a far more patient killer than any mercenary. As they climbed higher toward the geothermal sanctuary, the air grew thin, and the temperature crashed to a lethal 60 below zero. William Wynne's body was a map of old injuries that screamed in the cold. His frostbitten fingers struggled to grip his tactical staff, and every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. Smokey was flagging, his powerful gait slowing as the snow reached his chest. They reached the tree line where the forest gives way to the barren rock of the summit. There was no cover here, no warmth, just the infinite white. William found a small, shallow cave, barely a crack in the granite, and pulled Smokey inside. He knew the protocol. He unzipped his parka and pulled the shivering K9 against his chest, sharing the only thing they had left, their own biological heat. In the silence of the high peaks, William looked at the hard drive. It contained proof of the corporate-engineered famine, the data that could end the new order. But as he felt his own heartbeat slow, he wondered if he would ever deliver it. "Just a little longer, Smokey," he whispered into the dog's ear. "The mountain protects its own." The hum wasn't a mercenary drone. It was a rhythmic thrum of a heavy-lift rotorcraft, a specialized Arctic rescue bird. As the dawn light broke over the peaks, a team of men in unmarked white parkas descended on ropes. These were Miller's men, the government unit that had chosen to go rogue rather than let the corporations rule. They hadn't come to arrest William Wynne. They had come to recover the savior of the February storm. They found him in the cave, two frozen statues of ice and grit. But when the first medic touched William's neck, a pulse beat back. The veteran was too stubborn to die. Within hours, they were inside the geothermal sanctuary, the heat of the earth slowly thawing their bones. But there was no time for recovery. Miller stood over the mapping table, his face grim. "The corporate militia is moving on the seed banks in the valley. They want to burn them. William, if those seeds go, the people won't just be cold. They'll be starving. We need your tactical mind. We need the man who turned a backyard into a fortress." William Wynne looked at Smokey, who was already standing, his K9 harness being refitted by a technician. The soldier stood up, his broad shoulders shaking off the lethargy of the cold. The mountain had protected them. Now, it was time for them to protect the valley. The helicopter banked sharply over the ridge, the valley floor appearing as a patchwork of fire and shadow. Below, the regional seed bank, a critical life support node for the entire northern sector, was being systematically purged by corporate arson teams. They wanted a monopoly on life itself. If they controlled the seeds, they controlled the future. William Wynne checked the seal on his fast-stroke gloves. His heart hammered a steady, rhythmic cadence, the war drum of a man who had finally found a cause worth dying for. 30 seconds, Miller shouted over the roar of the turbines. Smokey stood at the edge of the open bay, his paws braced against the vibrating metal, his eyes locked on the figures moving below like a wolf watching a flock of sheep. They didn't land. They dropped. William descended the rope with a speed that defied his 50 years, hitting the ground in a tactical roll as Smokey plummeted beside him, cushioned by a high-tech K9 rappelling harness. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning grain and chemical accelerants. The madman didn't call for surrender. He simply opened fire. Every shot was a statement. The earth does not belong to the highest bidder. As the corporate mercenaries scrambled for cover, they realized the legend of the backyard veteran wasn't just suburban folklore. It was a warning. The fire at the seed bank was extinguished, but the true work was only beginning. William Wynne didn't wait for the military accolades or the cameras. Instead, he did something the corporate entities could never understand. He started planting. In the ruined soil around the facility, still warm from the fires, he used his legacy seeds from the mountain retreat. He gathered the surviving scientists and the neighbors who had followed him from the suburb, and he taught them. He taught them about the geothermal veins, about the resilience of the earth, and about the fact that a community is only as strong as its ability to feed itself. Smokey sat on a high mound of earth, a silent guardian watching perimeter as the valley began to transform. No longer was it a corporate asset. It was a common ground. But the corporate masters in the distant cities were not finished. They were preparing a final, desperate strike, a chemical defoliant intended to wipe out the Wynne rebellion once and for all. William looked at the sky, sensing the change in the wind. He knew the clouds were coming. He reached for his respirator, his moss-green eyes hardening. The madman was ready to protect his harvest, no matter the cost. The chemical attack failed, but it was merely the curtain raiser for the corporate endgame. Ground forces, a full battalion of heavy mechanized infantry, were now converging on the valley. They didn't want the seeds anymore. They wanted the madman's head. William Wynne stood at the entrance of the primary seed vault, the very place where the legacy of humanity was stored. He wasn't wearing his gardener's apron. He was in full combat chassis, a relic of his special operations days that he'd kept in a hidden mountain cache. Beside him, Smokey was a coiled spring of black and tan fury, wearing reinforced K9 armor. The sun set behind the peaks, casting the valley in a bloody crimson light. "They think we're just farmers," William whispered, the sound amplified by his tactical comms. They forgot that every farmer is a soldier when his land is at stake. As the first armored transport breached the perimeter, William didn't retreat. He triggered a series of seismic charges, collapsing the only access road and forcing the enemy into a narrow kill zone. This was the moment of truth. The veteran, the dog, and a handful of loyalists against an empire of greed. The first shot rang out, echoing to the canyon like a thunderclap. The battle for the future had begun. The morning after the siege brought a silence that felt heavier than the snow. The valley was littered with the charred remains of corporate hubris. But the seed vault, humanity's last bank of hope, remained unblemished. William Wynne stood on the highest ridge, his tactical armor scarred and soot-stained, watching the sun rise over a world that was fundamentally changed. The corporate militia hadn't just lost a battle. They had lost their grip on the narrative of fear. As the smoke cleared, the neighbors, the rogue soldiers, and the scientists emerged from the bunkers. They didn't see a madman anymore. They saw a founder. William felt the weight of his 50 years in every joint. But his moss-green eyes remained sharp as he watched Smokey trot through the thawing mud, his spirit unbroken. They began to rebuild, not as a suburb, but as a sovereign collective. The geothermal heat from the mountain was redirected to warm the entire valley floor, creating a microclimate where life could flourish even in the heart of winter. William knew that the corporate entities would eventually return with lawyers or louder guns, but for now, the earth was singing. He took off his helmet, feeling the bite of the mountain air on his face. He had spent his life fighting for borders. Now, he was finally fighting for the soil itself. Years from now, they will tell the story of the veteran and his dog who dug a hole in a suburban backyard and ended up saving the soul of a nation. They will talk about the February that froze the world, and the madman who saw the storm coming when everyone else saw only clear skies. William Wynne still lives in the valley, though the silver in his beard now outweighs the black. He doesn't hold office, and he doesn't give interviews. He spends his days in the soil, his hands, once built for destruction, now dedicated to the slow, steady rhythm of growth. Beside him, Smokey, older now but still possessing that fierce, athletic posture, keeps a silent watch. The greenhouse is no longer a hidden bunker. It is a global movement. Communities across the continent have begun to dig, to prepare, and to plant, following the blueprint of a man who refused to let the cold win. As the sun sets over the peaks, casting a long, golden shadow across the thriving valley, William looks at the legacy he has built. He knows that winter will always return and that greed will always hunt the weak. But he also knows that as long as there's a shovel, a dog, and a heart hardened by discipline, the light will never truly go out. He whistles once a low, familiar sound. Smokey stands, and together they walk back into the warmth of the earth.